Hello, everyone. We're going to call this meeting of the TRPA Transportation Committee to order. The date is Wednesday, October 23rd, 2024. It is 12:02. The first item on the agenda is the roll call to determine quorum. Mara, if you could help us.
Ms. Bowman? Here. Mr. Bass?
Here.
Ms. Hayes?
Here.
Ms. Hill?
Here.
Mr. Hennigan?
Here.
Madam Chair, we have a quorum.
Thank you very much. I will now go over the remote and in-person meeting rules for the day. For the members of the public who are joining us remotely to observe the meeting, go to trpa.org under the calendar heading, click on Governing Board Hybrid Meeting for October 23rd, 2024. There you'll find a link to the public webinar hosted on Zoom. To address the committee members directly with your comments, please raise your hand in Zoom by clicking the raise hand button at the bottom of the screen at the appropriate agenda item. With your hand raised, you'll be unmuted by TRPA staff, have 3 minutes to address the committee. If you use the dial-in numbers to join us by telephone, you can dial *9 to raise your hand and be unmuted. For items that are agendized as well as informational only, we will hear public comment during general public comment period at the end of the meeting. For items agendized for action or possible action, we'll hear public comment before the committee takes any action. To our remote committee members, if you wish to speak, please raise your hand in Zoom. You'll find the hand icon at the bottom of your screen. Remote committee members may not use the chat box or make any comments to have sidebar conversations. Everyone, please remember to mute your mic unless speaking. Finally, I would like to ask that all remote members turn on their cameras if they are able. Members of the public who have joined us in person, please raise your hand at the appropriate time for public comment, and you will be called to the front to speak. To ensure everyone has time to make their desired comment, you can agree with the previous commenter rather than making comments that repeat what others have said. Committee members who are in person, please raise your hand if you'd like to comment and speak clearly into the microphone in front of you. If you're viewing the webinar on a personal computer, please ensure that the microphone and speakers are turned off to prevent audio feedback into the room. If committee members need to ask clarifying questions during the presentations, please do so, but we'll save our deliberation until the presentation is complete. The next item is approval of the agenda. Are there any changes to the agenda by the staff?
No, Madam Chairman.
Thank you very much. We will deem the agenda approved as posted. And now we'll move to approval of our minutes. Agenda item number 2, we have a set of minutes from August 28, 2024 on page 69. Do any members of the committee wish to make a change? If not, I will entertain a motion. Okay. Okay, Mr.
So moved.
Thank you very much. And now we will, does anyone object? Seeing none. Well, so do I do a roll call vote for the, I'm sorry. No. Okay, all those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say nay. Hearing none, that motion passes unanimously. We'll now move on to item 3, presentation and possible endorsement of the Regional Transportation Plan Connections 2020-2050. Forecast assumptions. Information on this item can be found on page 151 of your packet. As a reminder, the public, after the committee discussion on this item, you may raise your hand in person to be called on or in Zoom to be unmuted by TRPA staff to share your comments. And now I'll pass it to Ken Katzman to present the item. Or John Hester, whomever.
Madam Chairman, I've got a couple slides to introduce all of the items. This is a summary of your work plan that was adopted by the full board, and you can see we are in the fall 24 time slot. And so today you will hear 4 items. As you recall from the work plan, really we've got 2 major projects we're working on over the next year, the Connections 2050, which is the Regional Transportation Plan, and funding policy, which will end up being a regional plan amendment. So the first 3 items are related to the Regional Transportation Plan, land use and demographic forecast that Ken will present, Ken Katzman. Then Nick and Michelle will present strategies for projects, strategies and example projects, and funding landscape, and then Dan Segan will present, kind of introduce the work he's doing on policy DP4. Next slide, please. So today, the way these pieces fit together is, and we're covering a lot today, so I wanted to make sure that you all had kind of an overview of how all these presentations fit together. The forecast, which Ken will go through, essentially lays out the land use and demographic assumptions that we then use as we model the transportation system to identify and refine project strategies and projects. That is kind of an iterative process as we go through refining that with the funding information that Nick will present. We will end up later on, but not today, later on with what's in the shaded box, which is our project list. There'll be two components to that. One is constrained, which is what we think we can cover with the foreseeable funding. One is illustrative, where there's not identified funding, but it gives us some ideas on what we might aspire to. And then we'll also be, like I said, Dan will be talking about the transportation funding milestones. That will lead into a regional plan amendment later on that talks about the milestones as well as what we do if we do or do not meet those milestones. So that's how all these pieces fit together. And I wanted to make sure that you kind of had that big picture before we get into each individual piece so you see how they work together. With that, I'll turn it over to Ken.
Thank you, John. So again, for the record, Ken Caseman, Research and Analysis Department Director. Next slide, please. So as John just laid out, the forecast and the regional transportation plan itself lays out the long-term vision for Tahoe's transportation system. And Michelle's going to talk in the next presentation about that vision and some of the projects that go into it and the policies. As you can tell from the title, Connections 2050, that is our long-term forecast, and we're looking out to 2050 with all of the forecast assumptions that I'll walk through today, starting from a base year of 2022. And just to talk a little bit about why 2022 is, we use dozens of input data to underlie both the trends of the past as well as to look out to the future. And a number of those data sources, in particular, things like traffic counts from Caltrans and NDOT, census data, we just simply don't have updated information beyond 2022 at this point. So that forms the basis of our base year model. But we are looking at other trends that have extended beyond that period as we start to develop our forecasts and as we think about some of the implementation that is both occurring as we speak, as well as trends that we want to forecast into the future. The forecasts themselves and the plan will look at both our existing policies and the likely transportation infrastructure and future that is based on our observed data. And really the modeling effort that we undertake is really designed to look at current and future trips, VMT and greenhouse gas emissions, and then to use our RTP planning process to identify those projects that will then reduce those future impacts. The regional plan allows for growth, right? Not all of the allowed development that is built into the regional plan has been constructed. Roughly about 90% of our development has been constructed to date. And so I know we heard public comment earlier, and we'll likely hear it again today. I want to be clear that the development that we're forecasting in this plan is all fits within those caps that are set under the regional plan, and are already allowed and were analyzed under the 2012 amendments to the regional plan. There are multiple levers that we use throughout this forecast to look at what that future scenarios will look like, including both the use of development rights, housing changes and demographics, and changes in the way that hotels and vacation rentals may be used. That all ultimately, as it goes through the model, will affect our forecasts related to population, visitation, and our transportation system. So that's essentially what we're looking at. And again, as John just mentioned, the constrained list is really important as we look at our projects that go into our modeling effort. So if you imagine both the land use piece that we're forecasting, but we're also going to build out some of those projects that are on that constrained list. So things like trails, connections between communities that we will then model the behavior on those connections. And so it's really important that we both utilize the forecast and those RTP projects that are here. Next slide, please. So very high level summary of the forecast. And throughout this presentation, I'm going to keep it very, very high level. Obviously, in the packet was a significant amount of detail. We really wanted to keep this discussion high level, but I'm happy to go into any of the specifics anywhere throughout. But basically, for the forecast summary, we're projecting a slight increase in our residential population, roughly about 0.25% per year out to 2050, which ultimately comes from our assumption that's built into the forecast of new affordable and workforce housing that are assumed to be occupied. Compared to our 2020 forecast, which was the last RTP, we're really not looking at significant land use changes. If anything, a slight reduction in what we anticipate to be constructed. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. And we are expecting a slight increase in visitation, both day and overnight. And we are expecting, in terms of second home use, that we would return to pre-COVID levels of second home use. Obviously, during the pandemic, we saw second home use spike. But as we've seen the last couple of years, that has moderated some, and we are anticipating in our future forecasts that it goes back to those pre-COVID levels. Next slide, please. So I'll just remind you, last October, I did a fairly detailed presentation on demographic and census information. So I don't want to revisit all of that now, but these were two significant things that I just want to remind us of. The first being that we have seen over the last 30 years a significant change both in the age of our population, as well as we've seen this change over the last 10 years or so in the distribution of households by household income. And so on the left, you can see the average age of a Tahoe resident in the 2020 census was 43 years old. And we have more residents over 55 than under 35. From a income perspective, you can see, the significant decline on the two sections on the left, which is basically our households with incomes less than $50,000 have dropped significantly. And on the far right-hand side, those households with income over 200,000 have doubled over the last decade. And so as we go into our forecasts, we want to keep in mind some of these demographic shifts that we're seeing in the data. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, about a 7% increase in regional population for the forecast, about 0.25% per year. And again, this is assuming that both the demographic shifts that I just mentioned and that that our bonus unit program, those units that we're projecting to be built using all of the remaining bonus units are projected to be used at the ratios that the board has set. So 50% of the TRPA pool being used for affordable, 25% for moderate incomes. So our assumption going in is that those would be utilized for those purposes, and further that those would be occupied by residents because those are prohibited from being used for second homes and vacation rentals. So because of that increase in occupied housing, we're going to have more population. It's basically a linear relationship there. We do anticipate that those units that are built at market rate or non-deed restricted levels would be occupied at a significantly lower rate. Again, we know today that roughly half the housing that exists in the basin is used for short-term rentals and for second homes. And so we anticipate that that a portion of the newly constructed market rate units would likely fall into that category as well. So that's built into these forecasts. Again, the assumption about those households being occupied, especially the affordable and moderate units. Again, you look at as Julie mentioned a few moments ago in her report, Sugar Pine just opened their doors for the first 68 units out of 248 that they're building. And they had over 600 applicants for those 68 units that opened up. So clearly there's demand for those. We know from our regional housing studies and the needs assessments that there's a need for these units. So I think it's a fair assumption that those would be occupied and likely contribute to additional residents in the region. Next slide, please. From a development right standpoint, again, essentially here we're talking about residential units, commercial floor area, and tourist accommodation units. Again, all of the units that we are looking at here are already within the development caps that are allowed under the regional plan. Our forecast here is similar to what we did in 2020. And what's important about that is 2020 was the first time that we actually projected in our forecast that not all of the remaining development that is allowed under the regional plan would be used in that plan. And we are continuing that assumption here. So we are building every available residential unit, but on the commercial floor area and on tourist accommodation units, there will be remaining development in 2050 that will not be utilized under our forecasts. And within this, we are also, in addition to that, assuming that about 100,000 square feet, or exactly 100,000 square feet of commercial floor area and 300 tourist accommodation units would be converted to residential units. That 300 TAUs that would convert is actually up a little bit from our last forecast. The reason for that is we know that the Motel 6 that has roughly 140 units is likely to convert to housing and likely affordable housing based on comments that the California and Tahoe Conservancy has made. And the units at Lakeside Inn have been removed, obviously
Testing, testing. Folks online, are you?
Yeah, I could hear.
Okay. Third time's the charm. So from an overnight visitation standpoint, this chart just reflects our hotel and vacation rental occupancy rates, which are for hotels is slightly down from 2018, again, which was the base year for our last forecast for 2022. But our hotel, or excuse me, our short-term rental, vacation rental properties are slightly higher. So we've carried forward those assumptions in our forecasts. In the model itself, the day use is not directly an input to the file, but we do anticipate that we'll show slightly higher growth in day visitation. And again, I think as we look at both of these, we do think it's logical to forecast a slight increase in visitation. And we have seen that both from the number of units that are occupied and that are rented, as well as from the data that we see out of regional lodging trends, is both this sort of slightly lower number of rooms being rented, but higher rates per rental that we do think will continue as well. And so we've factored that in. And again, that's part of the reason that we anticipate a slightly higher growth for day visitation as opposed to overnight, as those properties really maximize for profit as opposed to occupancy. So with that, next slide. Again, I'm happy to go into any more detail throughout the forecast, but today we're really looking for your endorsement that the direction that we're headed with these forecasts is appropriate. And the next step is for us to really build out the detailed assumptions at a zonal level. So, that is essentially what goes into the model, is a detailed assumption and zonal data that then allows us to look at traffic patterns, VMT, trips, and greenhouse gas emissions in the future. And then, as Michelle will talk about next, then to look at our projects and implementation efforts that will then seek to reduce those. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much for the presentation and clarifications. I look to the committee's members to see if anyone has any questions for the staff. I'm not seeing anyone online who has questions for the staff. I'm not hearing anyone. Okay. With that, we'll now go to public comment on this item. If any member of the public wishes to address the committee on this item, raise your hand now, either in person or by clicking the raise hand button at the bottom of your Zoom screen and dialing *9. You will be called on and unmuted by a TRPA staff member. Any members of the public in the room who would like to do public comment on this item? I'm not seeing anyone. And then, yes, Ms. Gustafson.
As a member of the public, I'm speaking.
Yeah.
I just had a question, Ken, on how we look at employee commute. I mean, your projections don't talk about that, and we're not keeping up with employee housing. And so that VMT is not being captured, and yet it's significant if we look at our region on greenhouse gas. So
Yeah, so employment wasn't one of the big categories that I really talked about, but we do forecast an increase in employment of about 3% in the forecast itself. And with the additional population increase that we're anticipating, we do expect some of that workforce to come back into the basin. Again, because of those priorities for affordable and workforce housing. But we do look at the external worker commute. So we talk about the model as being sort of this monolithic, model, but really it's made up of 3 separate components. There's a resident model, there's a visitor model, and there's a worker model. And so within that worker model, it does look at some of those changes. and we look at the traffic counts coming into the region, and we look at employment. And as part of our calibration work with our consultant, we do make sure that we're capturing appropriately the commute, but into the basin for jobs, as well as residents who commute to jobs outside of the basin.
Great, thank you.
Thank you very much. I see Mr. Flaherty is coming up for public comment.
Yes. Doug Flaherty, Tahoe, cleanair.org. And that's a difficult task because, you're basically using a crystal ball. But I think everybody knows that you've got to do some sort of projection. So I guess Washoe County is trying to push through their ADUs up there in Incline for everything under an acre, which could mean 1,000 to 3,000 ADUs, which would, of course, increase VMT and add to the county stated 6-hour evacuation time. And just wondering, oh, and by the way, with these projections, they're not going to do short-term rentals in the ADUs, but people that own homes can live in the ADU and rent their whole home out. So I'm wondering how those projections fit in. Not that you're required to answer, of course, but just kind of wondering.
Thank you. Does the staff want to respond to that?
Yeah, the forecast does, as part of our residential forecast, we are projecting accessory dwelling units to be constructed. And again, that a portion of those are expected to be part of that workforce housing and affordable housing element. It's not at the levels that Doug mentioned, but we did look at accessory dwelling units. And again, currently, as I mentioned at the beginning, what we're really projecting is our based on current policy. And so the current policy is that accessory dwelling units on parcels less than 1/3 of an acre are only allowed on the California side. So that is what we have built into the forecast today. And again, I think throughout this, and I appreciate Doug's comment about, it is a crystal ball. But we do this effort roughly every 4 years. So we will have an opportunity if there's new policy that comes online for housing, or if there's new policy related to accessory dwelling units or whatever, we will have an opportunity to revisit the forecast again in a few years. And as Julie mentioned in her comments earlier, our forecast, I think we've gotten a little bit closer, but we're still trending well below the forecasts that we saw in the 2012 regional plan, in the 2017 regional transportation plan, and even our 2020 plan for the transportation. Our existing development is below all of those forecasts. And so that's what we're trying to do is we've actually progressively ratcheted down our forecast assumptions because we're not seeing the level of development meet those projections.
Thank you for that.
Could I add
clarification.
one thing to that, Madam
Mr.
Chair?
Master, yes.
We have, as Ken mentioned at the outset, a cap on the number of development rights, and every ADU requires a development right.
Right.
So there's only so many of those that can be developed.
Especially in Washoe. So thank you for that reminder. Okay, any other folks in the room who would like to come up for public comment? I'm not seeing that anyone else does want to come up. So looking to the staff on public comment online.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We have 3 hands raised online. The first hand up was Helen Neff. Helen, please unmute to make your comment.
Hi, this is Helen Neff, Incline Village resident. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So my apologies for not submitting written public comment prior to this meeting. I would like to express my gratitude to the staff, the TRPA staff, for promptly replying to my questions regarding the reports in the packet, but I do still have a couple comments. So the data to accurately evaluate the number of overnight and day visitors is lacking. The staff is working with information that is available, the TOT revenue and the number of vacation rentals, which I don't think accurately reflects how many people are staying in a hotel room. That's easy. It's probably 2, but how many people are staying in a short-term rental? Perhaps the occupancy limit, the permits could be taken into consideration on that. And then from the U.S. Forest visitors are being considered, but not the California or Nevada state parks. So visitors to Sand Harbor State Park have increased from 950,000 in 2019 to almost 1.3 million in 2023. That's a 33% increase in 5 years. The state parks offer amenities that are attractive to many visitors compared to the Forest Service, which is almost exclusively to hikers and bikers. So I would highly recommend that the state parks information be taken into consideration. And then traffic counts, I would suggest they be evaluated by month, as our recent winters have brought many road closures and seasonal decrease in the traffic from I-80, 50, and 431. So using the summer counts would provide a truthful picture, as those months are when the roads are clogged. So on a positive note, I'm happy to see that some of the recommendations from the Vision Zero strategy and the Tahoe Active Transportation Plan are being incorporated into Connections 2050, especially the safety improvements for pedestrians and cyclists along State Route 28 in Incline Village. Frankly, we need action more than another report or study. After 50 years of TTD, there's still no transit connection between North Shore and South Shore or outside of the basin into the basin. And I certainly hope it doesn't take another 25 years to achieve this. 3.5 years ago, when I was hit by a reckless driver when crossing State Route 28 and a crosswalk with a walk signal in my favor, the highway patrol trooper is recorded on his body cam video as describing me as elderly. And I'm not sure how I will be described in 25 years. So safety throughout the basin and especially on State Route 28 should be prioritized. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next hand raised is Christina Hill. Christina, please unmute to make your comment.
Hello, I commented earlier, I'm sure you heard me. It's a little confusing to me, as if these are projections and these are, regardless if they're affordable units getting bonus units, so they're not having to get allocations or development rights. It seems like a lot of the affordable units you're talking about include achievable, which does not contain an income cap, so can have millionaires living there. That is not really affordable housing. And I'm really sad to see that there is no income caps on, now you're calling it workforce housing. So it's moving target, but it's still too much development to consider that will actually happen. I mean, I can see you projecting this is what we need, but we don't need it. We don't need to construct this development to accommodate people if it's going to ruin the environment and it's going to clog our roads with traffic and make it impossible to evacuate for wildfire. And so I hope you don't endorse this plan to provide for this growth. Thank you.
Thank you.
And the last hand raised was Brooke Lane. Brooke, go ahead and unmute.
Thank you. I have a question regarding the presentation, and especially when we talk about the need for affordable, achievable, whatever word you want to use. We know that basin-wide, there is a demand. We know that throughout the state, there's a demand throughout the country, and many would argue throughout the world. So this isn't an isolated situation, but when you spoke in your presentation about the opening of Sugar Pine and what a great event that was and what a great achievement that is for the city of South Lake Tahoe and the basin as a whole, you reflected on the fact that 68 units opened, but there were 600 applications. And because these are grant funded, both through the state of California as well as federal dollars, anyone in the country is allowed to apply for those openings. And so I'm encouraging TRPA to understand how many of that is local, because it makes it sound like there were 600 local people that applied for 68 units so far, but that pool is rather diverse. So that's my only comment. Thank you.
Thank you.
And Madam Chair, there are no other hands raised to comment.
Okay, I just have two clarifying questions that maybe the staff could look into. The occupancy level on STR permits, and the Nevada State Park information that Ms. Neff said was not calculated as part of this. And then Ms. Lane had that question on local occupancy. So I don't know if we can speak to that now or if that's appropriate, but I did want to point that out.
Yeah, I think so. In terms of the Nevada State Park, and we did have some email exchanges with Helen Neff, and I appreciate that comment. We can certainly add it to the report.
Great.
I think, part of the balance that we're trying to strike is the regional forecast, and overall, some of these changes that we're seeing are more localized.
Mhm.
And so certainly that, particularly on the Nevada side, we've seen our traffic counts increase. We've seen certainly that the recreation increase in those areas. But regionally, it's balanced out by declines in some of the areas like the traffic volumes coming in over Echo Summit have dropped significantly, kind of offsetting those at a regional scale. And so we do take into account in the forecast some of that more localized variation. And we talked about this with employment as well, and with population, that while the region itself hasn't seen a significant change in population in the last 10 years, we have seen localized changes in incline and in some other populations. And so we are taking that into account. But when we talk about this at the scale that we're at today, at the regional scale, it doesn't really measure up, I guess. In terms of occupancy of short-term rentals, I think, again, that's data that we get from the local jurisdictions.
Right.
That's reported, and all of the data, and I think there were a couple of comments about all of the data or most of these measures are reported monthly or quarterly at minimum. And so we are looking at the time period. So our model reflects kind of a late summer, early fall time period that's intended to replicate an average day in Tahoe with schools, with some recreation and some visitation, as well as normal weekday resident travel. So that's what we're trying to model with our forecast and with our base year.
Great.
And a couple other responses, if I could, Madam
Yes,
Chair.
thank you, Mr. Hood.
This is anecdotal because we haven't quantified, but I'm sure if you visited any of the Forest Service properties recently, like the Meeks Bay project or Zephyr Cove, they have a lot of amenities as well. So I wouldn't say they're less amenitized than the state parks. What is a little more, I can be more certain about quantitatively, is although we give bonus units out for affordable and workforce housing, they come out of the pool that is capped.
Yeah,
We don't
it's
create
finite.
new units for
Yeah.
it. So just want to make that clear.
thank you. Thank you for that clarification.
Yeah, and I just wanted to maybe reinforce that point also, that as I mentioned, the board has set criteria for how the TRPA pool will be used, and we followed that criteria. So half of the remaining TRPA bonus units would be utilized as affordable units. And again, when we think about those projects, so we talked about Sugar Pine, there are roughly 700 units that have been reserved for projects that we know of. We know exactly where they're
Right.
proposing and how many units they're proposing. So those are all built in the forecast. And similarly for the other development forecasts, if there's a project that we're aware of, it is constructed in the forecast.
Great. Well, thank you for that. And now that we have taken public comment, do we have any committee members who have comments or questions to add to the discussion? I'm not seeing that we do. Do we have any online? Mr. Bass? I'm not hearing that we do. If not, I'm ready to entertain a motion from, yes, Mr. Hohenman.
It's a bit unrelated, but the question came up about where the residents from Sugar Pine Village are
Oh,
coming
yes.
from. And I know with federal state money is involved, you can't make it locals only. But could we have a requirement that they have to work in the basin? Is that possible with that kind of funding? No, it's just
No.
anyone.
Yeah.
Anyone who meets the income requirements. Don't even have to work. Okay. That's frustrating. All right, thanks.
Thank you very much. All right. If there's no other questions or comments from the committee, I'm ready to entertain a motion. Looking to Mr. Honeman.
Sure, I will make a motion to endorse the proposed development forecast for use in the Connections 2050 Regional Transportation Plan.
Thank you very much. We have a motion. Any other discussion from the committee or comments or questions? Seeing none. So may I have a roll call vote, please?
Ms. Bowman,
Yes.
Mr. Bass,
Yes.
Mr. Henigman,
Yes.
Ms. Hill,
Yes.
Madam Chair, the motion passes.
Thank you very much. We'll now move on to our next item, item 4. This is a presentation and possible endorsement of the approach for the financial forecast strategies and projects of the Regional Transportation Plan Connections 2050. Information on this item can be found on page 207 of your packet. As a reminder to the public, since this item is informational only, members of the public are welcome to comment at the final public comment item. I will now pass this over to Ms. Glickard and Mr. Haven to present.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Committee members, welcome everyone online as well. Good afternoon. Yeah, I have about 19 slides. I'm going to go quick. It's going to be riveting information. You're going to, all of a sudden, no time will have passed. So we'll get through them pretty quickly. So I'm going to provide in those 19 slides our background and framework on 2 very important components of the Regional Transportation Plan, which are the projects and the funding. Next slide. So as I walk you through our approach and framework to creating that project list, then Nick is going to jump in with a few slides on the framework for our funding element. This is all something that is created and we have to do that check, right? That funding element is what creates the envelope for how much of that transportation vision we can achieve. The process starts with the larger regional vision, which is a transportation system in Tahoe that is interconnected, it's interregional, sustainable, it connects people and places in ways that reduce reliance on the private automobile. So that drives all of those transportation goals and policies, and we have to consider those when we put together that project and that program list, and all of this, again, achieving that full vision. But not without a few more checks, right? We have to do some kind of testing those projects and programs to see if we're able to meet 2 important targets. One is our VMT per capita reductions and our California requirement for GHG reductions. Next slide. So a quick revisit of the goals before we get into the strategies, right? These are our goals: safety, mobility, environment, prosperity, resilience, and performance that you all endorsed back in June. But really, it's this balancing act that we have to do with those projects and programs, helping achieve our goals while ensuring we're meeting those targets I just mentioned. Next slide. So a part of that framework includes how we categorize the projects, right? Our project strategies, as we call them. So we're proposing to keep our framework similar to our last plan. We have transit, trails, which is really our active transportation, our ped and bike network, technology, and towns and corridors. Slight change from the staff report on that title, but the content is the same. So we're going to begin with breaking down or building up the projects into these strategies. I'm going to walk you through each of those, and I'll be defining kind of how they help us achieve that regional vision. Next slide. So we'll start here with the 2050 vision for transit, which includes reliable, safe, and convenient transit, connecting all neighborhoods to the town centers, our town centers that connect then to recreation sites all around the lake. And of course, a longer regional service for transit that can connect Tahoe to the mega region as well. Next slide. So that is a picture of our full vision for transit in 2050. If you recall, John mentioned this too, we have to balance all of those needs with our foreseeable funding. However, it's still important to keep the big vision in our sights. We need to strive for the full vision, but are legally required to break out our projects into those two lists, creating the constrained funding list. That's with our future foreseeable funds, and the remainder on an illustrative or unfunded list. So speaking of funding, it's becoming clear that our revenue projection may not be covering our full vision for transit. The map here and the details shown are for 2030 services that are assumed to be the services into 2050. So we're going to need to generate more funding to get more buses on the road, to get services into the later hours of the day, and regional services we desperately need. Not all transit may be free in the future. We've discussed that a little bit at this committee as well. Some regional trips are assumed to have some costs to the user. Efficiencies are also a part of the plan, and the transit vision does include maximizing our services, thinking about which lines are redundant. On the North Shore, microtransit shuttle services, for example, that kind of kicks in those later evening hours when ridership is decreasing for some efficiencies. So replacing the larger buses with with shuttles. And Nick's going to be talking a bit more, as I mentioned, the revenue on this one. We have a variety of assumed revenue sources. However, not all of these may be used for transit operations. So we're also going to be back here. Transit is a big topic right now currently in the region. We're going to be back here at the committee discussing transit a bit more. Kira Richardson's going to be talking about some of those constraints we have and our role as the MPO in transit. And then, of course, there's a lot in flux on the South Shore. So I just want to let you know that the RTP is really focused on our services and our needs, less on who will be providing those services. But it's clear that even on the North Shore, we need additional flexible funds to really advance transit. Next slide. So now that brings us to our second T, trails. Over the past year, we've worked a lot on how pedestrian and bike infrastructure can help us get to our full regional transportation vision. That was through our recent, and you adopted the active transportation plan, our Vision Zero plan update as well. Those RTP projects today reflect those plans. Our vision is for that comprehensive network of interconnected, low stress and accessible bike and ped facilities that will be maintained year round. So next slide. Some of those project highlights that are currently on the draft constrained project list, still in development, include advancing a much needed path project on US 50 between Lake Parkway and Laura Drive, not too far from the offices here today. This includes a sidewalk on the mountainside where people are walking on the roadway. Also at the corner would be a connection to the event center. So that would be from Kingsbury Grade over to the event center. So this connection nicely to the future project also on Kale Drive, shown in the solid green up there on that left image. So on the other side of the South Shore, the right image there near the mobility hub at the Y, we'll be closing a gap via a new path through the Barton area and over to the Tahoe Sierra neighborhood, which would then connect to existing paths to the west of this project, over in the Y and over to the high school, as well as over on the east side, over to the college and onto Ski Run. Closing gaps is definitely a theme as I move you up to the North Shore for a couple highlights. Next slide, thank you. Several projects will help complete the bike and ped network, allowing for bike and ped access from Meeks Bay today all the way over to Kings Beach, Crystal Bay. So shown here, 3 segments, the first connecting Tahoe City up to Carnelian Bay, then onto the regional park, connecting a small activity node also within Carnelian Bay. And those neighborhoods then get to have a nice connection to recreation, an alternative to the highway facility we have today. And the last one will be improvements to the bike ped network to connect Kings Beach Rec area up to Crystal Bay. So these are just a few highlights as we're working our way through refinements on all of these projects. Next slide. So that brings me to our third T, our technology. Where leveraging technology is so important to better connect people with information about travel, parking options for everyday trips, recreation visits, and of course, our emergency needs. Additionally, building out broadband connectivity and electrical vehicle charging so that vehicle trips, when needed, generate lower levels of greenhouse gas emissions. Next slide. So our vision is really about leveraging. It's important in the technology strategy, not unlike the others, how we build technology into the other projects, like those I mentioned, whether that's requiring our bike and ped counters are built into path projects or new sidewalks. Another example is when we have roadway projects, they are all considering installing conduit, which allows for running future communication cables necessary. One of our policies today that we have in our plan. So some highlights here for those projects with foreseeable funds include planning funds for improving emergency communication infrastructure. The planning will then identify a host of future projects. That is the first phase of the recently awarded Protect grant. I think that's been discussed in Ms. Reagan's report today. Thank you. We're also going to be expanding the use of those existing road safety phone applications. That's a fancy word, but you know, when it's wintertime, you open up your NDOT app and your Caltrans app, and that helps you see where real-time information on the roads. Are they icy? Where are the plows? Where are the snow conditions? So those are really important applications for our safety to help with that Vision Zero plan. But the plan also includes smart parking systems, whether that's the reservation system like the one at Sand Harbor that was just piloted, or the dynamic pricing that is at the East Shore Trailhead today at Tunnel Creek. Technology also covers installation of transit passenger counting systems, helping us understand transit needs and operations. Today, newer mobility like microtransit and even our e-scooters are wonderful at providing origin and destination information that helps us plan services. Considering new counting technology for real-time traveler information, rather than just relying on our roadway loop counters that we have today. This is illustrated in these two maps. This would allow for real-time ped and bike counts along with vehicles at many more locations than we have today. This could even feed into dynamic travel signage. Stage one shown on the left is the pilot project that the Tahoe Transportation District is currently doing. And this evaluation of technologies has set them up nicely for eligibility to receive funds for the second stage, which would then help us build out that system of counters and data circling the lake. And so we have to plan for 2050. You've heard that today, a bit of a crystal ball. When it comes to technology, it's moving far faster than we can get our projects on the ground. So forecasting those future projects is a bit challenging, but we do have a couple of great planning projects over the next year. So we'll be able to better identify our needs in technology. That's our Protect grant mentioned. And of course, the update to our technology plan itself. The technology section of the RTP will also be speaking to future innovation. Those needs like the gondola on the South Shore, the city has been discussing. And we also don't know actually what's to come. What's that next mobility device look like? Maybe it's a floating scooter. We don't know. We've got hydrofoils on the water. Maybe we'll have hydrofoils on land. So that is something that we have to continually kind of keep up with, and it is growing quickly. Next slide. So that brings us to our last T, towns and corridors, which may feel a little bit duplicative sometimes, but really this is where all of those projects come together. Transit and trails, it's our land use connection as well. Our last strategy here, towns, is about connecting all of those projects and programs in a focused area and using those multi-benefit projects to create complete activity centers, whether that's in a town center with commercial uses, hotels and housing for residents, or along our more remote recreation corridors. So next slide. A large focus for those areas is complete streets, right? The sample image here on the right shows sidewalks and bike lanes and parking, all with water quality improvements like tree wells that capture that water. It's this mix of these improvements that make even Myers, where they continue to focus on streets designed for peds and bikes, connections to their town centers, parks and schools. They have a future highway improvement project coming up that'll have signage and lighting and landscaping in those plans. But the bottom image here too is a cross section of the State Line Street here on the South Shore, where they're going to be seeking to add sidewalks and bike infrastructure in the middle of our busiest town center. So those connections are really important. That'll be the town center all the way down to the lake. But there's also a future planning project we have, which includes completing various cross sections like this shown. That's going to help us then replicate those drawings, and they'll be based on various widths of streets so that we can have a nice template for how to build more sidewalks, better drainage, and even that bike infrastructure. So another highlight, the existing image here on the left is the one from the North Shore, which includes the multi-benefit safety improvement project identified from the Vision Zero plan. That will be an incline village on SR 28 from the western Northwood Boulevard to eastern Northwood Boulevard, quite a stretch there. So improvements with lighting and bus stop improvements, as well as crossings. On the one of the strategies that you will find on the RTP project list that doesn't start with a T, however, is just as important, and that is our operations and maintenance. As you can imagine, that's a big part of all of these strategies, especially towns and corridors like the one shown here, maintaining our sidewalks, our bike lanes, the roads shown in these images. They're all listed on our project list as well. Next slide. So I'm not going to spend too much time on the recreation piece here of these are our corridor plans. You've heard a lot about State Route 89 and SR 28. I know recently even Shannon Friedman provided a full report and a great update in the summer. But I do want to hit a couple notes. Member Lane today speaking about 89. So building on that momentum, some of the highlights for 89 will be a full corridor plan that in that plan, we'll have foreseeable funds that will be able then to complete more trail planning. That will be from Meeks to Emerald Bay. And a fallen leaf project also is in the plan, water quality and road improvements there. And of course, a small but not insignificant is a connector from 89 and into Pope Beach. Next slide. So trail and parking improvements along SR 28 is shown here, have foreseeable funding. However, there is no foreseeable funds to complete all of the transit services we've envisioned in this corridor. Beyond the existing services in the summer we have at Sand Harbor, which connects to Incline throughout the summer period. Next slide. So really, while today I wanted to share our vision and get you excited about some of those projects, it's really about, today is about the project selection framework that we are developing, and we're seeking your feedback on this as well. As while we're developing the projects, we thought it was important to bring this forward to you. So we do begin that selection process with an initial compilation of the projects where we look back and then we bring forward those previous planning work efforts I mentioned, the RTP from the 2020 RTP, as well as transportation performance recommendations, which you also heard over the past 6 months. We have our Vision Zero plan as well, highlighting that today. All of those plans I mentioned were developed with public and stakeholder input. And just this year, we also had our equity study along with when you approved the goals and policies, we were folding in a lot of the work from the equity study. We continue then with our forecast, and you heard about this, what Ken was talking about. That also, we're also seeking public feedback. Oh, forgive me, I'm getting a little jumbled here. The forecast you just heard about is also considered. With all of the public feedback, in addition to that, we've heard that helps us build that first phase of kind of draft projects. But then we have to check our updates on existing projects, costs and feasibility studies. We're looking then back at closely with the implementation partners and getting updates on their priorities and their projects. With that check back to that regional vision and all of those goals and policies. So it's a bit of an iterative process throughout this. Then we begin compiling those foreseeable revenue sources. That's really where we are today. Still working a little with the partner agencies and moving into our funding check. Nick's going to be diving into that in just a second. Those projects we identify with foreseeable revenues, make it on that constrained list. Those are all still aligned with our goals and costs and feasibility. Sometimes we don't have identified funding, but they're still important projects. So those then move on to our illustrative list. So the importance here, though, is that when a project is in the RTP, it is then eligible for several grant sources of funds. And you know how we are very dependent on those grants. So it's important that projects are in here. The project to be eligible for those various grant funds, right, still has to meet our vision, still has to meet all of those policies and goals. So we do have some priority projects that simply haven't evolved yet in the planning and feasibility. So those could be highlighted in the plan, but may not necessarily be on the project list. And a good example, I mentioned the gondola. We know it's a priority, and Mayor Bass has mentioned this as well at this committee. So it'll be definitely, it's a power. Our plan is visionary and needs to be about innovative things. Today is also an opportunity for public feedback, as these meetings are a part of the outreach that we do. And it's really, outreach is just in every step of the way as we go along. So phase 3 is where we get into our environmental analysis with the modeling. Ken touched on that quite a bit. Only the constrained project list is used there. So we may be used for that constrained list is what we then check our VMT and our GHG targets on. And again, an iterative process. We do that check, we do the modeling, and then we kind of come back and we review again those projects in our programs. But this all then feeds into our final draft with when all of the environmental work is complete. And that is where, again, we'll be back here with the committee for feedback, and we'll be asking the public for that feedback as well. So that then brings me to kind of where we are today, which is phase 2, and Nick's going to take it from here.
Yeah, I'll just keep rolling. Just for the record, Nick Haven here, transportation team. Don't want to bore you too much with financials, but it's just one of those core requirements that we have as an MPO when we develop a regional transportation plan. So you have heard a lot already on the constrained and illustrative, so I won't dwell on that any longer, but the constrained list or the constrained funding level is at about 2.35 billion. And that tracks actually with the last RTP pretty closely. I think a lot of funding sources ebb and flow over time. So it's pretty miraculous that we're actually really close to the last RTP. And then as you heard, the illustrative is really what are those projects that maybe don't have certain funding or timing for implementation, but have been identified either in a planning document like the active transportation plan, or have had some initial planning done on. Next slide. So what makes up that 2.35 billion? As we know, it's a mix of funding from all sectors. Transportation is probably one of the more sector heavy funding or funded programs, just in terms of the sheer number of different funding sources that go into projects. I think Tahoe does extremely well leveraging funding from various sources and is able to get pretty creative in terms of how it puts its financing packages for projects together. So what I wanted to point out here was that all of the sectors compared to the 2020 RTP have gone up. And one of the key concepts that I mentioned in August when I was before you was the fact that you don't see a regional line there anymore. And I think that really illustrates the success of the 777 Sustainable Funding Initiative in terms of local, state, private, and federal sectors all generating additional funding since the last RTP. And so that is a significant step and has increased essentially funding across all of those sectors. Some of those in the local space, we heard earlier about the T-bid on the North Shore, significant dollars going towards transportation, in addition to longstanding TOT and even general fund. On the south end, You see more investment in public transit over the last couple years that wasn't reflected in the last RTP. So that's starting to ramp up pretty dramatically with all of the local jurisdictions on the south end. You have Washoe County contributing more than ever. So I've been here for 26 years. This is the most local investment in transit that I've seen in true local funds. So it's a good trajectory to keep, and that's what we're trying to maintain. So some of the state sources that have increased in California, we have a couple Senate bills that have infused funding for transit, SB 125. And in Nevada, we're starting to see more gas tax, state gas tax being allocated to Tahoe projects through our advocacy. And then at the federal level, of course, we have a new transportation bill that was coming online right at the adoption of the last RTP. We have many new programs. Some of those programs we've already seen success with in the RAISE grant that TTD was awarded. You heard about the Protect grant and the SMART grant, all these cool acronyms that make words. I love it. So a lot happening on the federal level as well. And as you heard earlier from Devin Middlebrook, you know, we're still advocating. I think that's the thing here is we need to keep a maintained presence at the state and federal level, and obviously support our local governments as they look and explore new funding opportunities. Next slide. And so now, how do the projects match up with that revenue? So this is basically the statement to say, have we met fiscal constraint? Do we have projects that can fit within that envelope? Yes, we do. Green check. And unfortunately, we have a lot of projects that are beyond this list, that don't have identified funding, but still are needed. And what's become clear after this analysis and after this screening process that we do, that Michelle alluded to in that framework diagram, we work with all our local partners, state partners, federal partners, the staff level. We have the Transportation Implementation Collaborative that we meet regularly with. And we've gone through the project list and all the financial assumptions with them as well, just so you know, so your staffs have seen it. And so we're at a point now where we can have an initial list that gets us into the modeling aspect, that gives us a starting point to go out to the public in terms of a game plan and how the RTP implements that vision that Michelle just went through in a detailed manner. And so our project list aligns, and I think that analysis has shown that transit funding is still, and as this committee is well aware of, still remains a priority for the region. It's not like a capital project where you can get some funding together, build a project, you're done. Yes, you have O&M, but the capital is a whole different story than transit operations that needs to be sustainable and ongoing. So that is a good conclusion statement. Then I can let Michelle wrap up, but I'm happy to answer any questions.
Yeah, just one more slide. Worthy of a quick minute is really the ongoing outreach and development that we've been doing. This is the various outreach over the past 4 months. We've reached almost 600 participants, and we're really getting out there on the North and the South Shores, meeting with over 20 organizations and community groups over the summer. Our survey that we put out over the summer was asking respondents to help us prioritize those funding strategies. And we received over 375 responses. I think it's wrapping up in about a day or so. But most recently, you know, those one-on-ones with the partners that Nick mentioned, those are the important things that we're doing right now, is working with all the agencies who actually build these projects. Just, we did receive one inquiry on Monday, just a clarification in the staff summary that I made regarding the incline project. Ms. Neff referred to that as well. So one of the things that's important too is that you don't have to have a formal comment here. You can always reach out to staff anytime with any questions as we do continue to develop the plan. So now these committee meetings are also, as I mentioned earlier, a part of that outreach and that feedback. So that is what we're seeking today. Next slide. We would like to receive your feedback and potential endorsement of our framework today. Thank you.
Thank you. Great presentation. It looks like I misspoke at the beginning. This is for action, correct? Yes, okay. So we will be taking public comment after we discuss this with the board. So looking to committee members to see if there's any input in the room. I'm not seeing any. And then committee members online. Mr. Bass?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, good presentation. I do still have some concerns. I think that, not seeing, and I know that we're doing the corridor plan for 89, but just not having anything in the RTP there, understanding that, yes, that corridor plan needs to be done, but knowing that that's how we can get grants and funding, it seems like we need to have some plan for the 89 corridor. And then just quickly, yes, the gondola thing has been something that I've brought forward, or the city, but I do want to remind everybody, it's also clearly written on page 8 of the compact that that we must explore the utilization of a light, it says a light rail system, which in 1980, I don't think a gondola was considered because the technology wasn't there, but I do think that's something that, as I know it's unfunded, and I've hear you that it'll be mentioned, but I think it should be actually put in because it is part of the compact. And in talking with Caltrans and some of the different people that would be building that project, it's clearly what needs to happen for them to even give consideration. So and then one other project that I know is being considered at the TTD level, which was US 50 revitalization, currently was proposed to stop at the State Line Avenue at the state line. And I just really believe that needs to be reconsidered to go from the event center all the way through to Pioneer Trail. That's clearly where we need pedestrian improvements, and that project could get all of the pedestrian improvements all the way through that corridor. So I'd like to see that considered. And I think that's about it.
Thank you very much. Any other committee member comments? I'm not hearing any. Does staff want to respond to any of the comments by Mr. Bass?
Yeah, no, thank you, Mayor Bass. We will have, so each of the corridor plans, 89 and 28, have their own full plans. So the RTP will be doing some highlights in those two recreation areas for sure. Making sure, again, that the full vision is still shared, even the things we can't currently foreseeably fund. We'll definitely be talking about those. And regarding US 50 East, I think we'll continue. Oh no, I should go back to the gondola. I'm happy to work with staff, but what we will need is, some solid costs for the project is really what's important in our planning work. So we're happy to work and continue to work with you, Cody, on how we can get there with that. But it is, as you mentioned, it's an important one. Did you want to add something, John?
I'll just add something on the gondola. I worked on a real light rail project for South Virginia Street with the RTC in Reno. And the first thing we have to do is a feasibility study. What's the route? What's it going to cost? What's it going to carry? So I think we can get back together as staff and talk about, can we start working toward a feasibility study? Because that's the first thing we'll have to do. You may recall Member Bass about feasibility study for the water taxi, things like that. So we'll have to get some of that before we can put an actual project together, but we can talk about how we can get started on that.
Thank you. Now, I will go to public comment on this item. If any member of the public wishes to address the committee, please raise your hand now or in person, or clicking the raise hand button at the bottom of your Zoom screen by dialing *9 on your phone. You'll be called on and unmuted by a TRPA staff member. I see that we have a member of the public who would like to speak. Mr. Flaherty, please approach the dais.
Doug Flaherty, Tahoe, cleanair.org. Gosh, so much to say in so little time. $1.5 billion of additional projects and a stated reduction in VMT per capita. You've got to be kidding. I'm really looking forward to seeing your substantial data on this massive approach here and how you're going to demonstrate to the public and the courts that you're going to reduce VMT. So I think you guys are all living in a bubble up here in Tahoe. No wonder people reject some of the mindset up here. The economy is in bad shape, and you guys are acting like you can just go out and get these grants tomorrow and everything's going to be fine. That's subjective. It's arbitrary. It's capricious. And by attempting to adopt these types of grandiose, unreasonable plans or forecast based on no data whatsoever, something you've made up, is really an abuse of discretion. So I said at the retreat, and somebody mentioned technology is moving quickly. You can proceed like this all you want, but as technology emerges and the actual data becomes available, your deference that you've enjoyed over the years by telling stories is going to evaporate. But you have no leadership in the TRPA to change that. People are looking for reasonable approaches to protect the environment, reduce VMTs, no comment whatsoever about how all this ties in to achieving or reducing thresholds. You tell stories. Quite amazing. Said safety is the number one approach, increase safety and security of all users. What about wildfire evacuation capacity safety? Oh no, we want smart streets to protect bicyclists and pedestrians. That's all good, but just skip over life safety. Incredible. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Any other folks in the room? I'm not seeing anyone. And if we could go online, looking to the staff.
Madam Chair, there are no hands raised online to comment.
Okay. With that, I will close the public comment. Let's see. I don't think that, well, yes, you heard from Mr. Bass. Does the staff have the general direction from the committee?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair.
Okay, wonderful. We will now move into item 5. This is presentation and possible endorsement of the direction to update the regional plan transportation funding milestones. Information on this item can be found on page 211 of your packets. We'll now pass it to Mr. Segan to give us our presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairwoman Hill. Dan Segan, TRPA staff, for the record. First slide, please. So I'm going to start with a little bit of history. I've got about 5 slides. It shouldn't take more than 40 or 50 minutes to go through them.
Perfect.
So in 2021, as many of you remember, we adopted an update to the VMT threshold standards. Our old standard was based on nitrogen reduction. The new one really focused on transportation and sustainable communities within our region. And we adopted a goal to reduce VMT per capita, or basically the amount that each of us drives in our daily life in Tahoe, for residents, visitors, workers, everyone around. We also adopted 6 goals and policies within the regional plan to support implementation of that threshold standard to ensure that we get there. So 3 of those related to reporting and independent guidance that we would receive as we manage towards that. 1 established a series of milestones for funding. A 2nd established a series of milestones to track actual progress towards our standards over the 20 years of implementation. Excuse me. And the final one adopted a series of adaptive management actions that we would take in order to course correct to ensure that we reach our goal. Next slide, please. So the topic, and those are all in DP5 of our regional plan. You're all probably well familiar with those because we've talked about them. a fair bit. And today we're here to talk about the funding milestones. So if you transport yourself back for 6 months when we were developing the work plan for this committee, what the committee was charged with doing was reviewing those funding milestones and ensuring that they align with our transportation priorities. So you'll remember at the time and through discussions, a series of issues arose around those milestones. There was confusion that with some of the undefined terms in those milestones. There was confusion around what the specific focus was of those milestones, and were we actually raising money for the right things, or was it more of a generalized approach to raising milestones or to raising money? There was also confusion related to the accounting strategy and which projects and which funds counted towards these individual buckets. And the work plan that we developed worked through a series of steps to address each of those issues, and you were tasked with that by the governing board. And today we're here to talk about one small part of that, just the funding milestones. We will later be merging that with individual funding milestones as well as adaptive management actions to be taken if those funding milestones are met. So I just want to ground today's discussion in that background. Next slide, please. So this is the overall funding that we received in the last 5 years. So as part of the development of the financial forecast for the next RTP, we go through an auditing process where we look at money that came into the door in the last go around. So here we're looking at fiscal year 21 through fiscal year 25. We forecast that we'd receive just under $600 million for transportation. In actuality, we came very close to that, which is fairly impressive for an RTP. Next slide, please. And it's actually even more impressive when you consider, so large transportation projects are often shifted in between years, and that the $15 million that we fell short was largely a result. We had about 60 million in capital projects that moved to out years. So those are projects that will happen in the Tahoe region, just not within the time frame that we looked at. So we thought NDOT and Caltrans would put them on the ground during that period, and they're actually going to occur within the next period. If those monies had actually come in the door and were spent during this period, we would have been at 107% of our forecast. So fairly impressive. However, if you look at the breakdown by RTP strategy, we tell a slightly different story. And this is a story that both at the governing board and at this committee we've talked about in the past. We have done very well in the trails, in the technology, towns, and O&M categories. We've been very competitive in grants and getting those monies in the door, so much so that we've exceeded the forecast. We have been less successful in the transit area and are actually running below what we forecast. And part of that, if you're only looking at the top line dollar values, is masked, that disparity. Next slide, please. As we're going forward and forecasting money available for projects and the money that would be available to implement the vision that Michelle described, one of the things we do is we line up the individual funding sources with the projects that they could foreseeably fund. Overall, the transit vision that we have would cost about $47 million a year. The amount of money that we have, sorry, that's not $45 million a year. We have in reasonably foreseeable funding, $24 million a year. So if you're doing the math in your head right now, $21 million or about 47% of that vision would be unrealized at the existing funding levels or the reasonably foreseeable funding levels. That is by far the largest shortfall within our RTP in terms of all of the projects that we imagine that we would like to implement and the funding that we have to implement those. And in accordance with guidance from this committee and from the board in the past, that's where we have recommended a focus on addressing that gap as part of this and a part of developing transportation funding milestones within the regional transportation plan. I want to acknowledge, because I think most of you have seen the letter from the California Attorney General's office related to the item today. And I think one of the things that letter highlights is some ongoing confusion about all of these issues and a failure to resolve those issues. And I think that's not for lack of trying. I want to acknowledge the efforts, the ongoing efforts of the Attorney General's office and to continually meet with us and try to work through these. These are actually just really hard issues, and the policies that we are talking about are complex and often convoluted, and we could do a better job communicating to those. And we've spoken with them since receiving that letter and both agreed that it would be worthwhile to continue those conversations and continue to work through these issues to come through a common understanding so that we're all marching forward on the same path. Because I think we all have the same vision here. It's augmenting funding for transportation within our region to implement that vision and ensuring that the funding that comes in the door is less subject to the whims and annual fluctuations of individuals. So I want to clarify that the motion that we're seeking from you today to continue to focus on transit funding as the largest gap in the 2050 RTP is in no way a direction on how we achieve that money, and in no way turning the back on that long-term vision of attaining sustainable funding for transportation within the region. With that, I'll turn it back to you, Chairwoman Hill. I'm happy to answer any questions, and we could advance to the next slide, which is the motion. Oh, sorry. I didn't mean to short circuit discussion.
Oh, that's okay. You can keep it on the motion because, and I'm so glad you clarified, because what I saw today's motion was that this is iterative. This is the beginning of many conversations, and we're directing you to help us with that data. So I appreciate you clarifying that. Thank you very much. I look to the committee to see if there's any comments or questions. Okay, Mr. Bass online.
No, I'm okay.
Okay. Wonderful. And I think that this really dovetails very well with the legislative update that we received from Mr. Meadowbrook on all the work that we're trying to do. A lot of the work that we're trying to do in Nevada is ongoing operation support. So I'm very excited about this opportunity to continue this discussion with the team and at this transportation committee. Now we will go to public comment on this item. If any member of the public wishes to address the committee on this agenda item, please raise your hand now, either in person or clicking the raise hand button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. By dialing *9 on your phone, you'll be called on and unmuted by a TRPA staff member. Any folks in the room? Welcome.
Good afternoon. Yes. Gavin Feiger, Policy Director at League to Save Lake Tahoe. No big comments today. We've been talking a lot with staff and, appreciate this direction. We are where we are. It's been a year since we were talking about this last time. Can you believe it's been a year since this all kind of blew up last year? No big projects have come through. I don't know if that's a good or bad thing, but for this purpose, it's probably good. Really going forward, want to focus on what I guess two things. One is that, yes, we agree focusing on transit funding is huge. It's something tangible. It makes it easier when we're doing our lobbying efforts at the league also to have something specific to ask for. It's been shown to be the biggest need. So that, and these are updated every 4 years. So I think it's a really good direction for the next 4 years, but not, and Dan said this already, but not as a substitute for all the other work too. We still need a long-term sustainable revenue source to fund more than just transit. And I know you guys all know that. So looking into the next few steps here over the next couple of months, and especially the repercussions. So, milestones, consequences, that's the next step. It's going to be difficult. We don't want to have, a consequence get in the way of, a big idea. We still want to be able to go big without consequences, but, with sticking with the intent of the VMT threshold, want to keep the pressure on and make sure that something does happen if we don't achieve our goals. Because, to other points we've made, if we're not, the RTP is one of the biggest pieces of, one of the biggest things we have to offset the impacts from development. So, without implementing the RTP, Means the regional plan is not being fully mitigated, so approving development gets harder and harder for us to support. So with that kind of logic, that's where we're at, really needing to have some security and some assurance that, that we will meet these goals and implement regional transportation projects, to protect the environment. So thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Flaherty.
Just a question of process. Is there a general public comment period after this?
Yes, sir.
There is. Okay, so we have another chance to do general.
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you.
Any other public comment in the room? I'm not, oh, yes. Gustafson.
Hi. I had a question and I continue to struggle with how we sustain the discretionary dollars already being spent by local jurisdictions toward the end goal of continuing this. And part of the way to do that is through banking and credits and opportunities to incentivize, because I fight really hard to get more and more transportation dollars into the system. But without seeing rewards for that, other than, more potential concerns being raised on projects and new development, I'm struggling with keeping the momentum behind that. And so I just want to encourage us to look at what we can do to bank those dollars, make sure that we're accounting for those in some meaningful way, to incentivize local jurisdictions who are taking discretionary dollars and investing them in these solutions. Help me, help us, and I guess is my plea, because without some meaningful acknowledgement of those dollars, where we're spending, I think I'm sure the most in the region out of discretionary dollars, I need help supporting that, and not just continuing to say we haven't met the goal, therefore nothing. We've got to see some, and I think it's a reward to other jurisdictions then to step up. I think it sets a model that helps local electeds go up against very tough and challenging situations to do that. So I don't know if that's a question or a comment, but there you go.
I love it. It's like our STR program in many ways of kind of how does each jurisdiction measure up? And
If I could
yes, Mr.
respond with
Hetzler.
a comment / question back. I think one of the very tangible ways is what you're doing locally is a match that gets more and more from other sources. So perhaps we could ferret that kind of information out. I'm looking at the staff. And that might help a little bit. So.
Well, especially as we're looking, we talked about it. I raised it several times when we were talking about VMT and saying, dollars aren't the answer, but the programs are, the services are, and what funds those services are the dollars. So where are the credits? Where are the opportunities to recognize that in VMT banking, project banking, incentivize that so that I can keep that momentum going? Because there's many draws on these dollars, especially as it relates to housing as well. And many of our other projects that are coming forward for the county and law enforcement, other things. So I want to keep them here, but how do I make sure they are getting credit in some manner?
Yes, Mr.
Can I clarify
Yes.
and repeat back what I think I heard the direction was? Because what I believe you're directing us to.
I'm not on the committee.
Well,
It's not direction.
I'm on the committee, and I said, I like this idea. I don't know, haven't seen nods from the committee members, but perhaps you could say what you heard back from what I had understood.
I think what I understood during public comment there was direction to explore incentives within the adaptive management system for exceeding funding targets or hitting funding
Yes,
targets.
that's what I heard.
Okay.
That would be great if we could further that discussion of the committee. I'm seeing some nods. Okay, great. Thank you very much. Any other committee member, any other public commenters in the room? I'm not seeing anyone, and I look to online to the staff to find us online commenters.
Madam Chair, there's one hand raised so far. Steve Teixeira, please unmute to make your comment.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Madam Chair, members of the committee, folks in the room and online. Steve Teixeira, longtime transportation activist in the region. There seems to be this traditional reference to VMT issues and development. And I think in the data that Mr. Caseman presented earlier today, once again, we see that the day use factor is significant and growing. So we need to not think about just development in the region as the cause of VMT and penalize development in the region because of that. I did go to VMT summer school this year that was put on by the California Association of Councils of Government. And while there's a lot of disagreement amongst the so-called experts on VMT, one thing is pretty clear, at least to me and to many others, that the biggest misapplication of VMT is when it's applied on a per project basis. So I think it's important to state that for the record and for everybody to understand that those issues of, always penalizing development, raising VMT like there's no other cause, and the misapplication of VMT on a per project basis. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other public commenters online?
Madam Chair, there are no other hands raised to comment.
Okay. Is there any other committee member comments or questions in the room? I'm not seeing any. Anyone online? Mr. Bass?
Nope, I'm good.
Okay, I am looking to for a committee member to help me entertain a motion. Mr. Honigman.
Sure, I'll make the motion to direct staff to prepare transportation funding milestones for transit operations and maintenance to implement the vision of the regional transportation plan.
Thank you very much. And I'd love a roll call vote, please.
Just quickly interrupt. Did you want
Yes.
to add the direction that Dan added in response to your and Cindy's comments?
Yes.
Yes.
Is that enough or do
That's
you
making
need
the motion.
more on that motion?
Staff, you have sufficient direction.
Okay. All right, with that, we'll take a roll call vote. Thank you.
Ms. Bowman,
Yes.
Mr. Bass,
Yes.
Mr. Hennigan,
Yes.
Ms. Hill,
Yes.
Madam Chair, the motion passes.
Thank you so much. Now we'll move into item 6, our committee member comments. Do we have any committee members that have comments for us today? I don't see anyone in the room. Mr. Bass?
Nope, I'm good to go.
Okay, thank you. Now we'll move on to our final general public interest comment period. Any member of the public wishing to address the Transportation Committee on any item listed or not listed on the agenda may do so at this time. Individuals or groups who have already commented on items listed on the agenda are not permitted to comment on that same topic. The Transportation Committee is prohibited by law from taking immediate action on or discussing issues raised by the public during public comment. Finally, comments must relate to matters within the jurisdiction of the agency. Any member of the public who wishes to speak at this time, please raise your hand now by clicking the raise hand button at the bottom of your Zoom screen or dialing *9 on your phone. And it looks like we do have a public commenter in the room, Mr. Flaherty.
Doug Flaherty, TahoeCleanAir.org. Increased height, density, coverage, international destination projects, increased density code changes with 6 to 14-hour evacuation times in the Lake Tahoe Basin can easily lead to this in case of a fast-moving no-notice wildfire. With regard to Paradise, Richard Brown, 74, was found deceased under his pickup truck in Concow. The DA's office said he was trying to hide from the fire. The body of Andrew Burt, 36, was found just outside a minivan near his home in Paradise. The remains of Burt's dog were found next to him. Based on evidence gathered, Burke had been in the minivan trying to escape the fire when the vehicle was overcome with flames. There were 3 other vehicles containing the remains of 4 other victims near the minivan. Joanne Caddy, 75, was found dead inside her home in Maglia. Barbara Carlson, 71, was found dead inside her home in Paradise near her sister, Shirley Haley. Vincent Carrata, 65, was found inside his Paradise home. Carrata, a partial leg amputee, did not have a car. Oh, we want to get rid of the cars, make everybody walk. Dennis Clark Jr., 49, was found dead in the passenger seat of a car with his mother, Joy Parter, in the driver's seat. Their vehicle was in a line of cars in the 5,000 block of Edgewood Lane in Paradise, roughly 3.3 miles from her home. Evelyn Klein, 81, was found in her home in Paradise. She was physically immobile and could not leave her home without help. John Digby, 78, was found dead inside his home in Paradise. Gordon Dice, 66, was found dead in his home in Chico. Butte Creek Canyon, according to his daughter who fled the house with her father, Dice went back to their home for something and never came back out. Paula Dodge, 70, was found between the cars in the carport of her home in Paradise. Her husband, Randall Dodge, was found deceased next to her. Randall Dodge, 66, was found between two cars in their carport. Andrew Donner, 54, was found deceased outside the front door of his home in Paradise. According to the district attorney's office, it appears he died while trying to escape the fire. I could read 86 of these. You guys need to get a reality check. Stop the more. Leadership needs to change direction in this basin. We're already under public peril, and you're ignoring it, especially two of your members up here that have forced increased height, density, and coverage and international destination projects down the throats of Tahoe residents at the expense of their safety. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other folks in the room? I'm not seeing any. Anyone online?
Madam Chair, there are no hands raised to comment.
Okay. Well, thank you everyone for a wonderful meeting and looking forward to continuing the dialogue. We are adjourned. Oh, do I need a, sorry.
So moved.
Thank you, Mr. Honigman. We are adjourned.